Warning. Today's Spicy Monday video is more of a rambling lukewarm cup of coffee than your typical rage bait. If you were hoping to start your week off angry and riled up, I am sorry to disappoint you. You're going to feel more like you got a mild friction burn than your typical Spicy Monday hot sauce regret heat. Please tune in next week for more of the typical pearl-clutching spicy content you've come to loathe every Monday. On to this week's middling rambling Dean Speak.
What is up, my trunk-slamming friends? It's Monday. That means it's Spicy Monday. I know not all of you are trunk slammers. Some of you have soft close hinges on those trunks, and they don't make a sound. On this Monday, I want to talk a little bit about a topic that Ashley got going over the weekend about community, and I am going to tie it back to something I want to rant briefly about, which is networking speeds. And I know that seems really weird. Why am I talking about networking speeds and community? Stick with me, folks. I am going to sound like you combined a Dean with Tom Lawrence for 2 minutes. So over the weekend, I finally got around to a project I've been putting off for 6 years since we moved into this house, which was properly wiring up my network with Cat 6 and mounting all of the random ass 𝘊𝗎 and other IoT stuff that's just been dangling out of the walls, or has been like the 𝘊𝗎 access point's been sitting on that black printer behind me for 6 years. That stuff's all mounted now. Turns out 6 years is my tolerance for not mounting stuff. So that's all done. Everything's wired up. I'm looking for, I have an old EdgeMax Ubiquiti router, and I was trying to get more throughput from it, and I was Googling some ideas, and I found an old Tom Lawrence video from like 2017. Thanks, Tom. That got that sorted out for me. And in the process of doing this whole networking project, I now was able to go into my 𝘊𝗎 site manager and get some more insights into what was in my network. As one does after they've completed the project, you want to play with it. I'm going through, and I found there was a few things in my network that were only showing up as consuming fast Ethernet, 10100. For those that don't do networks or any of that stuff, that was an internal, like inside your building networking speed standard that was, you know, I don't know, latter half of the 90s up until roughly 2005 was standard. And then around that point, we started getting gigabit internet, which is the fast internal internet, which has now been a staple of anything you buy to plug into your network for 15 years at least. So a few things that weren't using gigabit internet, that's weird. I shouldn't own anything like that. And so I went and I checked, and two of the things, in fact, were old technology. One of them's I'll make a video on it sometime, is an Ethernet to parallel port print server, and I will explain why I still have that running at some point. One of the things shocked me. It was my RokuUltra. Roku is, if you don't know, a first to market, pretty high-end, or at least used to be pretty high-end streaming device manufacturer, and the Ultra is their, or was their, flagship 4K streaming device, and I have it downstairs, and we use it to watch all our TV and movies. I'm like, well, that can't be right. It's a 4K streaming device that's from 2001. I must have made a mistake. And so then I spent the majority of Sunday afternoon troubleshooting the wiring. I swapped out multiple interconnect cables between that and the Flex Mini it was attached to. That didn't solve it. Then I figured I had terminated the cable to the Flex wrong. So the Flex said it was a gigabit cable, but I didn't believe the Flex because it's a shitty piece of 𝘊𝗎 equipment. So I used Network Tester 1. I didn't believe Network Tester 1. I used Network Tester 2, the fancy one. It also told me that the cable was fine. I didn't believe that either. And then I tested from the switch as well. And after 3 things told me it wasn't the cable, I did something I should have done to begin with. And there's a lesson here if you're a tech. I Googled the RokuUltra and found out that, oh, it comes from the manufacturer with only 10100. What the fuck? And so that's where we're going with this pretty interesting conversation today. So the reason why it only has 10100 is what this has to do with communities. Turns out that's on purpose. And it turns out that's on purpose because according to Roku, that's all its users need. That's all its end users would ever need. And saving 3 cents on the bill of materials when they make that wasn't why. It was basically because, well, of all the users they know that love Roku, none of them need gigabit internet, so no one does. No one does anything with streaming services, internal or external, that could possibly take advantage of more than 100 megabits per second of speed. If you've bought a streaming device from anyone else in the last few years, like an Apple TV or even a shitty Chromecast, that all has gigabit internet, so, the rest of the industry disagrees with Roku. Does Roku have a special user base that only likes shitty, slow internet? Or are they falling victim to sampling bias and not really understanding the needs of their community? I'm going to talk about communities in this video, but all the concepts I'm talking about also apply if you make a product or offer a service. So vendors and MSPs are not off the hook, just not roasting you directly, but all of this is a problem in any space that produces anything to be consumed by a sufficient size group of people, which is what we do because we're in the user support industry, really. I had an interesting conversation the last few weeks with 𝘆cie𝗂𝗿𝗿. She's done some really great LinkedIn posts recently on this topic. I am meeting at some point in the future with a few folks from ConnectWise to discuss IT Nation. And as you know, I often talk quite a bit about conferences and community on this channel because I've been involved in them for so long. And I thought this Roku thing was a really great example of a common issue I'm seeing. So if you think of it, this Roku was first to market with streaming. Back in the early 2000s, they were the original name in high-end audio streaming devices that an audiophile who had a network would use in their house. If you were into high-end AV in the late 90s and early 2000s, Roku was it. That was the game. So they were basically first to market, and for a very long time, they were unquestionably best to market. Nobody made something better than they did. Roku doesn't have market dominance anymore. Apple doesn't have market dominance on music players anymore. Polaroid and Kodak were both first to market with digital camera equipment, and they're definitely not even around as other than zombie brands anymore. So we've seen this happen a bunch with stuff. We've seen it happen with services like Blockbuster. Over and over again, there's plenty of examples you can come up with where somebody was first to market with an idea. Their first implementation was also fantastic and set the standard. And then eventually they faded into irrelevance. And if they are still around, definitely aren't the best anymore. I would still argue Roku's amongst the best. But you get my point. And the same thing happens a lot with communities. Many of the communities that we all hold dear in this space were some of the ones that were basically first. MSP Geek's a great example. That was really the first employee-driven MSP community that existed. Yeah, we had our MSP, but that wasn't just employee driven. MSP Geek started off really for employees and then eventually expanded into what it is now. We have stuff like IT Nation. You know, ConnectWise certainly not the first ticketing system on earth, but one of the first to call itself a PSA, and also one of the first to have a MSP focused large channel event that's been going on forever. Look at some of the other groups and communities from back in the day, and I won't name all of them so I don't sound like I'm 1,000, but you can all think of something from the ye olden times of this industry as a community that was early, that was first, that was really the best for a very long time. And now it might not be. How did that happen? I mean, certainly in the case of Roku didn't wake up and just get lazy and start making shitty products. Apple didn't over time decide that, you know, the strategy that served us well for 10 years with iPods of putting really high quality components into a not quite affordable package, we're going to stop doing that and we're going to make them for, you know, $10. They didn't start doing that. None of the other services we talked about started making objectively worse stuff. But in each case, we have a group or a community that a lot would argue now has kind of lost sight of what originally made it excellent, and has, you know, whatever the product or the service that they had has kind of drifted in an effort to do question marks now isn't what we wanted it to be. And if we take off our nostalgia glasses and, you know, sort of filter through some of the nostalgia, what causes us to feel that way, I do think most of these things we're talking about aren't quite as good as they used to be. Most of the products we use, a lot of the services, a lot of the communities. And it's not that anybody stopped producing quality. It really comes down to what I think is a common issue as these types of products and communities solidify and codify and get a large enough recurring user base that sort of is going to buy into it either way. We start falling victim to a sampling bias. I worked for a lot of entrepreneurs over my life, and a thing I've noticed that a lot of entrepreneurs do, lots of people do this, it's just easy to pick on entrepreneurs. They will take If there's a particular prospect, client, or customer that is very important or exciting in that moment. So that could be the really big deal they want to close. That could be somebody that has a lot of revenue with them, somebody that they're buddies with, whatever the criteria is. If there's a particular voice that is on their radar right now that they are very invested in, any feedback that one voice gives, that entrepreneur tends to take very seriously as a direction on where to innovate, add features, improve, or remove things. Being that I'm not an entrepreneur, it's really, really funny to watch externally because you will sometimes see product, service, community, whatever, the product category pivot to go over-engineer basically nonsense to appeal to one person when none of the other people that either pay them revenue or participate in whatever they're doing have ever asked for that. I know you've all done it, and I know you can all think of at least one time where you have done that, whether it worked out for you or you didn't. And entrepreneurs will also take the 1% of times things worked and try and use that to justify the 99% they don't work. This is not a video ragging on entrepreneurs. Go rag on yourselves. That's a sampling bias issue. In a lot of large settings like communities, I think once a community gets established, and I'll keep using Roku here as an example. Once Roku became established as a market leader that had a full suite of products, 30 to 40% year-over-year penetration of the entire streaming device market, uncontested. Once you get to a point like that, and in a community, I think once you have a sufficient critical mass of recurring membership that keeps showing up, no matter what small changes you make, they just keep showing up. Once you get to that point, it is very easy to lose sight of the fact that the only people providing you feedback typically fall into two categories. They are either your raving fans, or they are people that can never be made happy anywhere. And if you've been in this position, look me in the eye right now, lie to me, and tell me you haven't listened to that feedback on either end and taken that to speak for the entirety of the group, because I know you have. And that's exactly how we end up with a modern, high-quality streaming device with only 10100 internet in 2021. It's also the same reason that we see some of the frustrating drama, membership burnout, and lack of value being seen in some of those larger communities that at some point in the past were darlings of the industry. There's a bit of feedback in each of these cases that board members, executives, entrepreneurs forget to listen to. That's the bulk of the feedback. That's probably 80 to 90% of the feedback. And it's the silence. It's the silence from people who are happily consuming the product as it is, or the service as it is, or the community as it is. And they do have expectations for improvement, but those expectations are generally so benign and considered to be so common sense roadmappy for something in that area, they don't get expressed. And they really don't get expressed at all until either you've broken so far past those expectations that the most vocal start complaining, which usually causes that feedback to get thrown out because those people are seen as squeaky problem people, or you get your most dedicated people who fully know the ins and the outs of everything about your product, service, or community. And as a result of having that level of expertise, have their own workarounds, their own ways to not fall victim to those frustrations. And they vocalize the lack of need for innovation, not directly. And that's where things start to get interesting. I'm going to use an example that I think a lot of you are going to understand to illustrate this concept. We were a lab tech shop for a very long time. And then when it became an automate shop, and I had the time, energy, team, just the right things fell into place where we really learned how to leverage automate properly. And I say this because most MSPs that use automate don't. I know you don't. Most of you only use about 20 to 30% of the feature set. Granted, the rest of it is incredibly fucking difficult to use properly, so I understand why. But we did. So I then hung out with other MSPs that also did that. And so from our standpoint, up on our pedestals of greatness, all you peasants that couldn't use it properly or used other lower tier RMMs were fools and idiots because we knew what we were doing. I still stand behind that, you disgusting peasants. But the point is that if Automate or Lab Tech listened to us. And keep in mind, the people who best know how to use a product and get the most out of it are also likely to be brand advocates and the people who participate openly in the communities. So if I'm in a community for LabTech or Automate users and somebody says LabTech sucks, I can't do this in it, what's my reaction going to be? It doesn't suck. You can do that in it. You just don't know how. And then I'm going to teach them how to do it. But if we really break that apart, once we get beyond like basic product competency, I'm not really teaching them how to use it. I'm teaching them probably a decade's worth of workarounds and like compromises and different ways to sort of jury rig the product to arrive at that result. So if somebody says, I can't do network monitoring with Automate and therefore I need to buy this tool, and I say, well, hang on a minute there, you're wrong, you can. What I'm leaving out is it's totally possible if you know this entire library of things, have all this time on your hands like I had the last decade to do, and build it all out, then yes, you too can arrive at AUVIC level functionality with just the network probe and Automate, you peasant. Think about that practically though. I am one of the only voices you hear saying that on a forum or a community. And now the Automate team goes and surveys their users, and their most active and loud users either are only saying the product is shit, or they're like me and they're talking about how wonderful it is, but the level of knowledge and involvement I have is completely unrepresentative of the average user. Automate could sit back and go, you know what? We don't need to fix anything because it works perfectly. Look, our 5 most popular and upvoted power users are all able to do everything just like we intended. We made an awesome product. Swoosh. Let's go focus on some other little things over here and not really innovate in the core area. And I use Automate as an example because I still cherish the product, but as you all know, what has largely happened? Most of us who used it have gotten frustrated at the lack of innovation and updates and have been waiting every year for ConnectWise to finally make CWRMM do something useful. Guys, 5 years on ASIO, come on, like do fucking something with it. Right? And so look what happened. One of the first to market, best to market solutions for RMMs, LabTech, by no, malicious fault of anybody, stopped really driving forward meaningfully because those of us that loved it knew how to use it so well, we drowned out the voices of everyone who didn't. And so from a product standpoint, if they basically go and apply a sample, they're going to say, well, in all the places we look, the only people who talk about it love it and know how to use it, or are complete and utter douchebags, so ignore their feedback. And that other 90% of the feedback, which is silence, because let's say that there were 20,000 service providers using LabTech. If 100 of us are the ones that are vocal on all these platforms that love it, 1,000 of us on these platforms just get on and talk about how much it sucks, and I say this because this is exactly what's happening in Kaseya right now. What about everybody in the middle who isn't a raving fan, like an expert level person with it, but also isn't screaming it sucks? What about everybody in the middle who is happy continuing to use it, but was assuming this entire time that basic things would be moved forward on the roadmap, and so therefore wasn't really expressing that? Because why would you express that? Of course they're going to do that. Every other product is doing that. And now look what happened. Now I have a Roku that doesn't have gigabit internet because the power Roku users on the Roku forums who genuinely are not streaming 4K because you're going to get some sort of like, well, stream 4K is compressed and not really for a true, video and cinephile. So in my case, on my Pioneer Elite Plasma, I hand code my pixels in from, my flippable record-sized Laserdisc player, which is the original high quality. And then I have, my 3.2 pull-down up-converting box, which sits between that and my Roku and my TV. And those types of users, of course, are not begging for higher speeds because they don't need it, because they have engineered solutions around it, because they're at such a tier of involvement that really those features don't really appeal to them. And the squeaky people who just talk about everything being shit and just post that, this is crap, well, that gets ignored because that gets ignored universally. And everyone else that was just quietly sitting there assuming that, well, the next one obviously will have it, doesn't. 90% silent majority of any group, they don't really give feedback, although they do still have expectations for you. And eventually, if you fail to meet their expectations for long enough, they will just quietly drift somewhere else. It will not be a grandiose exit. They will not all leave at once. They will not, you know, throw their ex's clothes and stuff out the window dramatically like a TV show. They'll just stop doing business with you or stop going to your community. They'll start to deprioritize it. And they'll go somewhere else with those eyeballs, somewhere else that at least in that moment is more innovative or more aligned with them. And you'll be sitting there going, huh, what happened? We used to have 8,000 members or 100,000 members or 100 members. And it technically still says that they're there, but only the same 20 people ever talk anymore. What happened to our community? You had a sampling bias. You listened to the wrong parts of the sample. I don't think that any of these communities are unaware of that. I think they're all aware of the fact that it's being used less and they're losing their sort of, you know, first to market dominance. I think where it starts to break down is they can't figure out why. When you look back at it, a big part of the problem now is that sampling bias. The leaderships of a lot of these groups are made up of the most vocal, most invested members. You know, if we go back to any of those other examples, well, the most invested, most vocal Roku users don't give a shit about, you know, having gigabit Ethernet because they wouldn't use that anyways. The most vocal or invested people in your local mega mall probably aren't talking about closing it because they're literally invested in it. And same thing with a lot of communities. And if they then only listen to their friends, which we go back to entrepreneurs earlier, only listening to the prospects that excite them the most, and then only listening to the most vocal members of the community who are either the power users or the shit goblins, it starts to become really hard to course correct. Even if you want to, even if you've identified you need to course correct, it's really, really hard to, because everybody that you have available immediately to you is either a sycophant, a power user, or garbage. And the remainder of that group, the other 90% of it, you don't even know how to talk to anymore. You don't even know how to get feedback from them. And even if you ask them for feedback, even if you have feedback available, no one fills it out anymore, because from the average user standpoint, why should I? It doesn't really seem to have any value. It doesn't really move the needle. The only ones that appear to get the microphone are the people who are the power users and the friends of the community, which I'm certainly not. And otherwise, anything I would say is common sense. Of course they're going to do it. And before long, like Blockbuster, like Kodak, probably like Roku eventually, it's gone. And no one can figure out why, because there was no real point at all in the history where it was bad, right? Like there was never a time where any of those brands or companies were like, yeah, that was the year they got shitty. Like it was never bad. It just didn't keep up. And it had good people who were constantly trying to work on it and work in it, but yet it didn't keep up. And it's funny because I use this analogy a lot. If you want a really, really, really great analogy of this in practice, look at the restaurant industry, specifically individual restaurants. So not large chains, individual restaurants. Statistically, a restaurant is lucky if it stays in business for more than 10 years. And if you have a restaurant that's been in business for about 10 years, around that time period, and you've been going to it as a customer for a while, there might be minor ups and downs, but usually like it didn't suddenly get shitty and go out of business. It just reaches a point where what that restaurant does and what it offers just isn't any up to date anymore with the 90% of the silent majority that were patronizing it. And the only feedback that restaurant gets are from its raving fans who always eat there, would eat there even if it was shitty, or from the people who can never be made happy to begin with. And how do you course correct? In that industry, that's an old industry. That's been a problem that industry has still not mastered after decades. And largely this space is no different. And so I started this off by saying it's a sampling bias conversation, and it is. So how do you overcome that sampling bias? You can't go around and force people to fill out surveys. I mean, you could. And so surveying, once again, is really only going to return an incredibly biased result, especially at this level. Once an organization has been around with this level of market penetration or dominance, surveying is going to have a very, very biased result of only the people who are already hurt, who are net detractors already, and you're not going to win them over almost certainly, or people who are already happy and will stay happy even if you reduce quality by 50% and start hitting people every time they interact with you. Those people are still going to give a positive feedback. So the remainder there isn't even going to engage in the survey. You cannot rely on the same group of people keeping the status quo exactly the same and trying to survey their membership base the larger and bigger the community gets, because that starts to break down. And you got to figure out a middleman, a middleware option that'll help you start to get an idea of that 90% silent majority and what they actually expect. Because I guarantee you, most of those people, if we really did get it out of them, they would think that their expectations are very mild and reasonable and are, of course, almost certainly on your roadmap. And I bet in most cases you would be like, huh, no, that wasn't on our roadmap at all. Or we didn't think that was important. Or in the case of Roku, well, we just figured nobody wanted gigabit Ethernet, so we just didn't put it on. It wouldn't really cost us anymore to do it. It's just no one's ever asked for it. And so we just figured you're all good with what it had. We were going to release it at some point in 10 years, but by that point, they won't exist anymore. And by that point, your community may not exist anymore. I'll finish up this Not That Spicy Monday video by making a few points. I noticed this year, and I talked about this in my video at IT Nation, I noticed that this year, IT Nation did a few things that were a pretty dramatic drift from the last decade. And to me, those looked like things where someone internally woke up to the fact that what we've been doing isn't bad, but definitely isn't addressing that 90% of the silent majority. Let's try some new stuff. And I think it was the right things for the most part. I have noticed that there has been a little bit of a shakeup in the approach to maybe how some things are going to get done, for example, in MSP Geek, and we'll see what happens over the next year. But awareness is the first step, so that's a positive. And I've seen in a few other communities and groups, this little bit of a light bulb moment going off that shit, we need to figure out how modern users consume us and what they want, or we're going to go the way of Blockbuster. So all of that stuff is a positive. I hope that none of these groups and communities fail, and I hope they're all able to recover and move forward. Ultimately, I think it's important too for us as the consumers of these groups, when possible, when we have opportunities to give our feedback and participate, we need to do that. And it can't just be that polarizing opposite ends of the spectrum feedback. You need to give normal feedback about regular basic things that you expect or that are just a given, you know? Because I think that's important as well. These large groups, products, services, they need to know when they're meeting expectations, not just when they're exceeding them or failing them. I think had Roku been actually polling its active user base over the last 10 years and realized now that the average Roku customer does have a gigabit Ethernet connection and gigabit network and is likely to internally stream stuff that could take advantage of that, they would have added the feature. It cost them nothing. I think just like this year, ConnectWise recognized that, hey, you know, maybe we shouldn't make the entire show only about buying ConnectWise. And they made some very small and subtle change, a lot of room for improvement there, but they made some small changes. Did anybody bother to tell them like, hey, it was nice that the booth was at the back of the vendor hall, or we appreciated the middle of the room was full of community tables, stuff like that? Because if we don't, we're that silent majority again. We saw that, assume that was common sense, and it's going to get repeated. We don't give that feedback. If we accept that these large communities and brands are not good at asking us for feedback, and no industry's really figured out how to get good at that. If we accept that as consumers of it, it's up to us now. Let's tell them. Let them know that. DattoCon being in Miami at small-ass hotels. How about we start telling them, like, listen, DattoCon, we like you. We don't mind that Kaseya took you over. You might mind. I didn't mind. But we do mind being crammed into expensive, tiny-ass hotels. We would all be okay if this moved away a little bit from being literally on Miami Beach to somewhere close by that was more appropriately sized. We would still patronize it. We would still be happy to go there. That kind of feedback. When's the last time you gave that kind of feedback? Have a spicy Monday. I know this was a bit rambly. It's a little bit hard to talk about sampling bias in this context, but I did want to talk about it a little bit. And just remember that ultimately entrepreneurs, business leaders, community leaders, by virtue of being in charge of something that is consumed by a critical mass of people, they will lose their ability to fully understand what makes the majority of their customer base happy. This happens in every industry. There is not a single industry anywhere that is immune from this. This happens in every large group of people. It happens with every government. It happens with every type of rulership. It happens with every type of religion, whatever you want to quantify. Once you're in charge of something that has enough membership and has had enough membership for a while, you will lose touch with what the average person wants. We know this. And we know that most of the methods that we currently use to try and overcome that either don't work or don't work very well. So what's really the only option left if, as consumers of these things, we don't want to find out that our 4K streaming player doesn't have gigabit Ethernet by surprise? We got to speak up. And we got to speak up without being raving fans or without being toxic. We got to speak up about the small things frequently and vocally to give these folks some actual feedback so that they can align what they're doing with what most of us want. Or we'll just be in this cycle forever of things that we all actually kind of appreciated, but never really talked about fade away and become irrelevant and become zombie products at best, or just stop entirely at worst. And I don't want that to happen to most of these things. I don't think you want it to happen either. Have a great Monday, everybody.